Good morning. Welcome back. Just a few minutes until we are officially live here, but I'm just establishing our stream again. So thanks as usual, everybody. And we will be going in just a couple minutes here. Hi, Kylie. Good morning. Good morning. Hi, Sebastian, Olga. Good to see you guys. Just another minute here. But welcome back. Hi, Christina. Jasmine, welcome. Hi, Cordy, Zoe. Good to see everybody. Good morning, everyone. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and let us get started. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks so much, as usual, for being here. It's Friday, February 26th, and today what we're doing is we're going to transition into a new author on this topic of ethics. I think we're finished up pretty much with the work of John Stuart Mill, but that's actually something I wanted to ask you guys about here. Based on your notes or memory, did we cover all the objections? Did we get to talk about, so let me know in this meeting, did we discuss the various objections to utilitarian theory, like, for example, that it could be seen as a theory fit for swine, or that it sometimes could be argued as too demanding, or, for example, that no action is absolutely forbidden in principle? Let me know if those things got mentioned. I think we did, but I just want to double check with you guys really fast, so I kind of know what to review or what to mention additionally from that meeting. I could quickly check on my own, but I just thought while we're all here together, you could just let me know. We did, we talked about those. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Lane. Yeah, so I'm just going to briefly re-summarize those briefly. So utilitarian ethics has been the lesson this week, and we've started on a new topic, which is ethics, theory of morality, what makes an action right or wrong, moral or immoral. When we evaluate questions like that, we're doing ethics. Okay, thanks, guys. Yes, got it. One ethical theory is the theory developed by John Stuart Mill called utilitarian ethics. Utilitarianism says that the right action is whichever action that generates the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. This is a consequentialist ethical theory, meaning that it defines the morality of a given action in terms of the consequences that come from the action. And the consequences that matter to utilitarian ethicists are those as they bear on overall human happiness. So basically the picture is that if you had a set of options and you wanted to take the right action, so to speak, then whichever one would generate the most overall happiness for the greatest number would be the moral obligation. And the alternatives in comparison to it would be those that are impermissible. I showed you how this can be applied to a choice situation, something very easy and simple like a pizza topping scenario. I think we also discussed how the theory is based on a couple of underlying principles. One is the greatest happiness principle, which claims that actions are right insofar as they promote happiness and wrong insofar as they promote the reverse. Happiness is seen in the theory as pleasure in the absence of pain. The reverse of happiness is pain in the absence of pleasure. And it is claimed that this is very intuitive because happiness or pleasure is already the only thing that each of us is pursuing as an end anyway, and not as a means. So that means, in other words, that happiness is the supreme and ultimate goal of every human action, and everything else that is desired only as a means to the ultimate goal of happiness and pleasure. So if happiness or pleasure is the thing that each person pursues in their individual lives, then we already seem to recognize it as a good, as demonstrated by our own behavior. So the more of it rather than the less, for not just one but for all, is why he thinks this is the correct moral principle or standard to live according to. And yeah, then we talked about the objections, everybody. I talked to you about how one of them is that it could be seen as a theory fit for swine. Some people think that because it is centrally focused on the promotion of pleasure, that it's telling you to live the life more like of an animal than a person. Someone might have argued or thought that as humans, we should have a more noble and worthy aim than something as basic as pleasure. Isn't that more appropriate for pigs and stuff who just lie around eating and rolling in the dirt? But what Mill says back to that is that there's not actually just those lower pleasures of animals, though. So when you hear the word pleasure, don't just think of what pigs and animals do. There are also higher pleasures, and those are the kind of pleasures that are only available to us intelligent humans, like think of literature, art, music, dance, technology, film, academic study of any subject, science, mathematics, you name it. These are things that don't have any significance or meaning to non-human animals, but they are the higher sources of pleasure. And he says that those actually matter more, they have greater weight, and so he refuses to admit or concede the point. I shouldn't say admit because that makes it sound like he actually has this problem. He refuses to allow the notion that his theory is a theory for swine, because at the end of the day, it's all about higher and lower pleasures, not just the lower ones. And he goes to some degree of emphasis to point that the higher pleasures are of greater value even. Okay, then the other two objections that we closed class meeting with were the point that it could be seen as a theory that is too demanding for us to really live by, and another possible objection that it does not forbid, at least not in principle, any kind of action. So we talked about how according to utilitarianism, we can imagine given scenarios where it would generate more utility for a person to lie instead of tell the truth. More utility when a person in some situations will steal rather than decline to steal. Or even in possible scenarios like the transplant case that I mentioned, we can imagine cases where it's going to create more utility for an innocent person to be killed rather than to decline to kill. But if you find those actions absolutely ruled out and forbidden and they're never okay, then that might give you a reason to find fault with utilitarianism, which says it just depends on the net outcomes of overall happiness. And then the other one about it's too demanding. If you really lived according to this theory, you'd be obligated to take actions that generate the most overall utility, even in cases where perhaps that action is inconsistent with something that you personally prefer more, or even more importantly, is inconsistent with an action that is done in the favor of those who you have standing relationships and partial familiarity with. So in a forced choice scenario where you had a shortage of time to act and you could only, let's say, rescue one or the other household, suppose that there was only one loved one of yours in one of those and a larger family of 10 in another house, but you don't know them at all. In utilitarianism, since there's more life to be saved over there, that equals more happiness if you take that action rather than the contrary. But wouldn't that, in most of our minds, be fundamentally inconsistent with our feeling of obligation and duty to those with whom we have a closer bond? Okay, anyway, so that's my little capsule summary of major points in utilitarian ethics. Now we're going to take another ethical theory and try and study and examine it. So we have 2 meetings dedicated to this, today and Monday. And they're both going to be on this man's work. His name is Immanuel Kant. So Mill is kind of like the granddaddy forefather of utilitarian ethics. And this person, Immanuel Kant, is a German philosopher of the 18th and just barely 19th century. He lived from 1724 to 1804. He's a German philosopher, and he's the forefather, sort of major figure behind what is called Kantian ethics, or Kantianism. It's named after him and his last name. Kantian ethics, Kantianism. Kantian ethics is a far different system from utilitarianism. And let me start to develop some of the main differences here. So I told you that utilitarian ethics is a member of the consequentialist school of thought. So it's a member of that family of theories. Just how, let's say mammal is a broader category than specific species of mammal, like tigers or lions. Consequentialism is a broader category, and within it fall different types of consequentialism, utilitarianism being one of them. Consequentialism is called as such because what it says matters morally are the consequences that come from the actions later. So I think I drew you this little diagram about consequentialism. where like a stick figure, let's suppose, is represented as taking an action, time passes, this is an arrow standing for time, and at the tail of the arrow, the consequences that materialize later in consequentialist thought, these are the things that define the morality of the action. So if these are good consequences, the action was good. If these are bad consequences, then it's not a good action. But now we are dealing with Kant, and it's a different picture. So I'm crossing this out so you understand for Kant, this is not the way he's thinking about ethics. To him, a different picture suggests itself. So let's show another figure here. Suppose that a person commits an action, and instead of looking forward to the consequences that happen later, we direct our attention back to the intention that the person had when they committed the action in the first place. So I'm drawing a looping arrow that points back to the person's head with the letter I drawn inside. And that letter I, let's say, stands for the intention that the person had at the point of action when they did it in the first place. And I put it in the head because intentions, that's where they form. They form within your mind before you do the actions that you do. So Kant says it's the intention, it's the will that you had that is the thing we should evaluate and judge morally, not the consequences that occur later. So Kant basically has this moral philosophy: act with a good will to uphold the moral law. And if you act with a good will, then that is sufficient for your act to be morally permissible. It does not matter if the consequences of the act play out favorably, unfavorably, if they create more happiness or less happiness. The consequences to Kant are totally irrelevant to the moral status of the action. The only thing that is relevant is the intention that the agent had when they committed the act itself. So if the intention was good, then there's no moral problem with the act and you can't be held morally blameworthy for it. If the intention was not good, then you deserve moral blame regardless of how the consequences played out. Let me try to say an example that will help you see major structural differences between utilitarians, consequentialists, and then this Kantian ethical theory, which is all about the will and the intention. Okay, so suppose, like, for example, hypothetical scenario time. Suppose you're driving around and you saw a motorist and another driver, but their car was over on the shoulder of the highway, and it looked like their car was disabled and that the person maybe needed some type of assistance. Now, I know it's pandemic time, so you're not trying to necessarily get close to anybody that you don't know. But, you know, I taught this class so many times before the pandemic, that was a going example that I used. Whatever, let's pretend, I don't know, everyone's vaccinated, something like that. Anyway, you get the case. The person's in their car off to the shoulder, and it looks like maybe they need some help, but no one's there. So you're a good Samaritan, let's just suppose, and you pulled over your car, walking over to theirs to see if there's any way you could help or assist. So let's say you get up towards the front, and you look in, and the person is actually unresponsive and unconscious, still seated in their car, driver's seat. You're trying to arouse their attention. Hey, excuse me, hello, can you hear me? Are you okay? Do you need any help? Hello, are you awake? They're not responding to you, but you can tell that they are alive, they're breathing and all that. So you're kind of a little perplexed what you should do next. Let's say you look towards the front of the vehicle, and now you actually see that there's a little damage up on the front, and that there's even a couple little tendrils of smoke emanating up from under the hood of this vehicle, okay? So you're now a little worried about the driver inside of the cabin because you don't know, maybe this car could get caught up in a fire from the engine, maybe it could get engulfed in flames or blow up, and you don't want this person to be in that kind of harm's way. So since no one else is on the scene and the person won't respond to you yet, you take this decision. Let's imagine that you decide, I'm going to gently remove them from the car and lay them off to the side so that in case something happens with this car, they will not be harmed by it. Okay, so let's say you do that. Now, some time passes and first responders are finally now arriving on the scene. They get there, they see you, they see this person laid out on the ground, and they see the car. And now they just start asking you some questions. They say, hello, how do you know this person? How are you guys related or what? And you say, well, actually, I don't know them. I'm a total stranger, but I was just a good Samaritan passing by and I could see their car. I got out to see what was going on and I noticed they were unconscious. So here we are. Now, imagine the paramedics follow up with another question and they say this. Okay, well, when you got here, what's the situation with him laying on the ground over there? When you got out up to the vehicle, were they already on the side of the vehicle on the ground or did you move them or what happened? And you say, okay, yes, actually, so the thing is, when I walked up, they were in the car still. But if you look, you'll see there's a little damage, and I was worried about maybe if they got stuck in the car and it caught fire, then they could get killed or whatever. So I moved them out of caution and concern. That's why I did it. I gently moved them to the side of the road. That's why they're there. And now suppose that this paramedic is getting a little annoyed with you and they're saying things like this. Well, you know, sir or ma'am, the problem though is you really shouldn't do this unless you have a professional there. You don't necessarily know what you're doing. You see, with accidents like this, if the person's unresponsive and you're not exactly sure the nature of the injury, if they have spinal injuries or something, you're supposed to have a proper backboard and a neck brace so that if you move them, they're immobilized. And if they're not properly immobilized and they have an injury like that that you're not aware of, then the movement of them itself can cause further breaks in the spinal column, and that could cause paralysis. So did you know that? And you know, you're kind of a little bit worried about what you did, but they say, and by the way, you're watching too many of these movies in Hollywood and stuff. I mean, the cars, they don't generally blow up. This car is not going to blow up. So anyway, you feel bad in a way, but at the same time, you're thinking this, well, come on. I mean, I had the best of intentions. I wasn't trying to hurt the person. I just wanted to, you know, provide for their safety because I thought that that's what I was doing. Now, suppose as it turns out, you know, they get back to the hospital and what they find is that through moving the person, you actually did cause dislocation in some of the vertebra. And now, because of your action that you took, they don't have motor control from the neck down for the rest of their life. So if you hadn't been on the scene and these first responders had gotten there before you, then this person would have been better for the rest of their whole life, and they would have been much happier for the rest of their whole life, maintaining as they would have their motor control from the neck down and all the pleasure that comes from having that level of physical control of your own body. So, okay, you heard the scenario, just had to describe it. Think about our two ethical theories. We're still learning a little bit about Kantianism, so the picture's coming into focus, but even just for now, what you know, that Kant is all about the intentions and the will that you had, whereas the utilitarians care only about the results. Let's look at this from two sides. So would you say a utilitarian theory, what would its position be? Was this right or was it wrong morally to have moved the person in a utilitarian way of looking at it? What is that? What do you think? So from a utilitarian standpoint, moving this person, okay, yes, Sydney, wrong. And why wrong? Well, I'm sure you know, because the consequences were much worse than had you not done so, right? So like by taking this action, you did not promote the most overall happiness. You, in fact, did the manifest opposite. You made this person much less happy and miserable for the rest of their whole life. And if you hadn't done that, then none of those things would have happened and they would have been so much happier going forward. So you actually did something that eliminated a lot of happiness. But from the Kantian point of view, would that theory say this was immoral and wrong, morally speaking? And maybe you can give me the answer and let me know why not or why. Kant. Would the Kantian ethical system say it was wrong, or what do you say? Just kind of want to make sure that we're clear about the distinction in the two theories, and this case helps expose a little those differences. Yeah, so, right, again, Cordy, in the Kantian way of looking at ethics, this was not a wrong action morally, because although the consequences were not good at all, the consequences don't matter to Kantians. They're evaluating morality not based on results or outcomes, but instead intention that you bear when you take actions. And since the intentions in this case were just, noble, righteous, you're trying to provide for someone's safety and security, even though you inadvertently made the situation much worse in a consequentialist sense, you didn't intend for that and you had a goodwill. So we wouldn't claim of the action here that you're to be blamed morally or that you should be claimed as having done something wrong from Kant's standpoint. So it's just a way different ethical system. If you're a Kantian, don't worry about what the consequences may or may not be. And for one reason, we can only speculate sometimes as to what the consequences are. In many cases, it's not fully clear what the probable consequences of an act can be. But what we know we can do is set our minds to act with a goodwill in every case. And if we do that, then basically let the cards fall where they may. Sometimes the consequences will be favorable, sometimes unfavorable, sometimes somewhat in the middle. But what we should really judge people morally based on is the will that they have when they take actions. And sometimes you can have a good will, but the consequences don't work out so well. Like, I think there's an old saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, but I don't know if I agree with that statement. It's a little cynical. Usually I think good things happen when you have good intentions, but not in every case. sometimes, like as we've seen in this one example, you can mean well, but you cause something unfortunate to happen anyways. Kant says, look at the will only, not the results. If the will was good, then the results being bad does not change the morality of the action. And if the will was bad, on the other hand, you had a bad intention, then even if good results occur, that won't vindicate it. Like suppose like a kid sees two people running and he wants to be a troublemaker, so he tries to trip the person running behind. He thinks these are joggers. But after he does it, the person in front says, oh God, thank you so much. This person was chasing me, trying to steal my purse. I know you could tell that I was crying out for help, so you saved my life. Now, they tried to actually just cause an injury and mess with people they thought were joggers, but they inadvertently did this act. Was it really a heroic moral act? Well, it was intended with bad intent. So morally speaking, even though the consequences were beneficial, it's still not a good thing. So anyway, if you're a Kantian, we're not going to game out the consequences of each available option and try and act in accordance to the most overall pleasure. We're instead going to just try and set our mind to act with a good will and a good intention, and then let the consequences be whatever they may be. Kantianism is a member of a family of theories. So I told you again that utilitarianism belongs to the consequentialist school of ethical thinking. Kantianism also can be traced to a broader category of ethical theories. And in this case, it belongs to the family called deontology. So deontological ethics. And what deontology says is that you should act to do your moral duty, regardless of the consequences of doing that. So deontology, the word deon comes from Greek, which means duty. And so deontology is the ethics of duty. It's any ethical system which says the main thing for you to focus on is doing your duty, not to worry about the consequences. And do your duty even if it produces bad consequences, because it's your moral duty itself. The consequences aren't important, but living according to the moral law and doing your duty is. Now, what Kant says is that you act with a good intention or a good will when you act from the motivation of duty to uphold the moral law. Kant's ethical system of deontology is his own, and it has some unique features, but there are other deontological ethical frameworks that I could compare and contrast it with. Let me just quickly mention one, since I do think I talked about hedonism as a point of contrast to utilitarianism, even though they're both consequentialist theories. In the same sense, with deontology, another member of the deontology school of thought would be divine command theory. And divine command theory is the ethical system based on religion and God, which says that what you're morally obligated to do is just whatever God commands. And whatever you're morally forbidden from doing is just whatever God has commanded you not to do. So like, if it says in the Bible, thou shalt not kill or steal or covet thy neighbor's wife or whatever, then in that case, these are commandments not to do things, and that's your moral obligation to not do those things. But if God issues commandments for what he wants you to do, then that becomes your duty. And according to deontology and divine command theory deontology, if it's God's command, whether it's to do or not do something, that becomes your moral duty and your moral obligation to follow the commands. There's only some problems, though. There are some problems, though, I could say, with deontology. Like, for example, there's obvious problems that it is based on the existing belief in God, and although most and many people do believe in God, not everybody does. So for a person that's not convinced or skeptical about God's existence, divine command theory would have no force, because if God didn't exist, then there's no commands from a being that doesn't exist. But suppose that a person believes in God, of course, there still could be problems, because believing in God doesn't settle the question, which version of religion is it that a person is being commanded to follow, since there are some obvious differences from religion to religion, or from even denomination to denomination. Even within one religion, you can still say there's issues, because to determine what the commandments are, you have to be able to learn about them in some written biblical text. But there are issues of translation, interpretation, which make it complicated for some what exactly the commandments ought to be, or how they can be consistently interpreted. And then the final issue with deontological divine command theory, just this is a little sidebar discussion, but I think it's interesting to give context. The real most philosophically troubling part about it is that it raises this question: can God make anything moral just by commanding it? If so, it makes morality seem kind of arbitrary, like it's just based on directives given by a being with no content. And on the other hand, if you say, no, there are some things that even God could not make moral, then it would appear that God himself is not the author of morality, but just kind of a channel that it flows through, because there are some things that even he cannot, will to be moral or immoral. As an example of what I'm talking about, okay, let me refer you to the case of a biblical story from the Old Testament. I don't know if some of, or many, or however many of you are familiar with some of these stories, but there's an account written there about the story of Abraham and Isaac. So anybody who knows about this parable of the Old Testament Bible, you can let me know in the chat, but I'm going to continue talking about it for a bit. So Abraham, according to those scriptures, was the first person to receive God's covenant. And so the Abrahamic covenant, named after Abraham, that was given to Abraham. God said, let's have a exchange, basically. If you spread my word and message to the people, then I will secure a promised land of Israel for the chosen people and liberate them from the rule of the Egyptian Pharaoh. So basically, it's like if Abraham is the emissary of God's word throughout the world, then he will ensure Israel as a safe haven for the Jews, and that's written in the Old Testament. So Abraham becomes the messenger of God in the Old Testament, and he's therefore described as kind of like the knight of faith, the most allegiant to God. So one day then God wants to test Abraham's loyalties, and he gives him this commandment. He says, Abraham, I would like for you to kill your son Isaac, okay? Now, obviously, that's deeply disturbing to Abraham, because anyone who has a child, they love their child, and the last thing anyone would want is to be responsible for the child's own death. So he's kind of conflicted, of course. He's hearing God say, you got to kill Isaac. I want you to slay him at the top of Mount Moriah. And so he wants to do this because it's God, and he says, like the divine command theory would have it, anything God commands is a moral obligation. It doesn't matter what it is, it's God, so I have to do it. On the other hand, he is deeply worried about, his son. He loves his son. He doesn't want to kill him. But he's prepared. So he takes Isaac up to the top of the mountain. I don't know what his pretense was. I forgot that. But he didn't exactly tell him, I'm going to kill you up there. He just says, let's go hiking. So they get to the top of Mount Moriah. Does anybody know this story, by the way? If so, someone let me know. Does anyone know how this ends when he gets him up there to the top of the mountain? Abraham and Isaac? Just checking with you. You want to know how the story is going to go from here? You have no knowledge? Let me know that too. Just kind of want to see a sense of, okay, Cordy, you know about this? So what does happen then, Cordy, after that? Do you kill Isaac or no? Okay, it's a little vague. Well, let me add some details. No problem. So everybody, here's what happens. Abraham's up there. He's prepared to slay his son, but at the very last moment, God does a switch. He substitutes Isaac for a ram, and then the offering on the mountaintop becomes this ram, which is given as an offering to God. So he spares Isaac in the end. But it doesn't really answer all the deep, puzzling ethical philosophy questions. Like, for example, was God inevitably bound to withdraw this commandment to kill his son because it's just not okay to kill a person's son? If there was no way that God could have actually followed through with the command because it's just too wrong, then it makes it seem like God actually can't just make anything right or wrong merely through his decision or will or through an arbitrary act of fiat. But if God really could have seen this through and made him do the action, then again, as I said before, morality would strike us as somewhat arbitrary and completely up to the whims of a being without any necessarily intuitive force that is the right thing behind it. So anyway, a different kind of deontology that doesn't make any appeal to the nature or existence of God, just the concept of human reason, is Kant's ethical system. So now, Kantianism. What it says is this: act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law, and that's when you show a good will, and that's your moral obligation at every time. Act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. And that's when you show a goodwill. So let me write that here. Goodwill. goodwill or good intention, because he kind of uses them interchangeably. Goodwill is seen or demonstrated when you act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. When I teach Kant and I say it's all about acting with a good will and a good intention, I give that hypothetical of the stranded or the disabled motorist, and I get the feeling that the students think, oh, well, it's pretty straightforward and it's easy to understand. Just act with a good will, no problem. And I mean, yeah, that is pretty much of a common sense idea, but for better or worse, Kant doesn't leave it at the everyday level of understanding. He really gives this technical definition of a good will. And what he thinks a good will is, to be precise, is any situation where a person acts from the motivation of duty to hold up and uphold the moral law. Now, more on the motive of duty for a moment. He says it's the goodwill which is shown by acting from the motive of duty is the only thing in the world that is unconditionally good. So he says the only thing in this whole world that is unconditionally good is a goodwill. All other desirable characteristics or traits that people can have are not unconditionally good. So let me put that point here and then we will discuss. Why is it that we are emphasizing the goodwill above all else? Because to Mill, it was happiness that was the centerpiece of the ethical system. To Kant, it's the goodwill, and here's why he says this. The goodwill is the only thing in the world that is unconditionally good. Okay, so the goodwill is the only thing in the world that is unconditionally good, and that's why he says it should be the focal point of our ethical lives. To comprehend this in full depth, we have to contrast the goodwill with other usually considered to be desirable character traits, because then we have to show how those other character traits that are often considered good and desirable are not always good. They're not unconditionally good. Those other traits, etc., are only good under certain conditions and not others. And that's where we see that the goodwill is more important than those. So here we go. I'm going to list, and you're going to help me. Just create a little barrier here. What are some desirable attributes or character traits? Okay, so now, to get a little quick list going here of these so-called desirable character traits or attributes, I just want you to think through it this way. Suppose if you ever had a child and you put a lot of effort into raising this child to be a good person, and they develop certain character traits and ways of being described that are a source of pride for you as a parent. So you're like, I'm really happy because I raised a good kid because they turned out to be so fill in the blank. A adjective that describes some traits of the person, which are usually regarded as good and righteous and valuable. So what are some of those things? Like when we say of a person they're good, we sometimes explain it by describing traits they may have. Now I'm talking about moral goodness, so not just like tall or anything, although, some of those things I guess are considered desirable as well. What would you say could be some of these? Okay, so honest, modest, okay, let's see, respectful, sure. Some of the ones you guys give me are going to be a little harder to work with than others based on his overall analysis. So let me try and push you in a few other directions too. I'll put kind, no problem then. So don't you think that you'd be happy if you raised an intelligent child that was smart and just not dumb or idiotic? So like intelligence, that's one of them for sure. How about, I'm going to throw a few more out there. What's the description or the word that we use to describe a person who they don't give up when things get tough? They focus on their goals and they see them through to their successful result, even if it takes time, even if they encounter setbacks. They don't let those setbacks deter them. They keep going. What's a word for that kind of person? Determined, okay, sure. Determined, motivated, words like that. That's usually considered a positive, desirable trait. You don't want a person that's just a quitter, rather determined. Okay, how about, let's see, persistent, persevering, resilient. Those are all very good kind of synonyms, so I'm just going to leave it with that. How about the type of person who everyone likes them? They're funny, they're, they're easy in a social situation to make friends, life of the party. This kind of person, we sometimes say, people just love being around them. They have that infectious personality. What's a word maybe for something like that? I'm just trying to cast around in a few different directions and hit on some of the ones that are mentioned by the author too. So I'm just trying to hint at, what that quality could be. You say charismatic, sure. Charismatic, quick-witted, humorous. Many ways we can put that, but I'll go with charisma since you put it there yourself. Sorry, it's a little cramped at the bottom, but I'm talking through them too. Charisma's good. How about, okay, now some of them he describes as like gifts of fortune, that not necessarily in this sense character traits, but still desirable traits. Like if you have wealth, rather than being poor. Most people would rather have some material wealth than to be in poverty. Power. You probably have some power to achieve the things that you want to do rather than just being powerless and ineffective at anything. Wealth, power. How about this? The type of quality we use to describe a person who's willing to face danger if it's needed, if it's important. So instead of being scared to face a dangerous situation, they're willing to do it. Brave, courageous, that's good, Sydney. Also, yeah, brave. People think of bravery as a desirable character trait also. And I've saved one for last, and I did that on purpose because this was the big ticket item for the utilitarians, the one that they said everything revolves around. But for Kant, this is also not unconditionally good, and I'm talking about happiness itself, happiness. Okay, so now let me go back through this list and explain his point. What he's saying is this. If you look at the list of qualities here, all of these things can be good, sure. They can be good. It can be a very good thing for a person to be wealthy, powerful, brave, kind, intelligent, determined, charismatic, honest, modest, respectful, or even happy. These could be good and fine things, sure. But the thing is, they're not always good. They can also be bad and dangerous or even scary if the person who has the quality is not a person with a good will. Okay, so like for example, let's start with intelligence. Intelligence, it's a great thing, usually. But in certain possible cases, there's a kind of person who, if this person had intelligence, you'd be a little like, wow, I kind of wish that person wasn't so smart because they're scary. When do you think intelligence could be in the wrong hands, basically? When is intelligence not so great? What kind of person do we hope isn't the smartest of all intelligent people? If the so-called intelligent person is, well, you give the case of a dictator, sure, Cordy, but without being over specific, in general, it's like if a person's evil and they have bad will and bad intentions, then the intelligence they have just equips them to be more lethal and destructive, right? So do you really want some evil genius mastermind building like sophisticated bombs to hurt people? No, if a person's going to have evil will and bad intentions, then you'd hope that they'd be kind of dim-witted and not so skilled and resourceful, right? Because intelligence in the wrong hands can make that person even more capable of doing whatever bad things they desire to do. So intelligence is sort of like this. It can be good or it can be bad. If a person with a good will has it, then they'll use it for good and all it will do is good. But if an evil person with an evil agenda or objectives has that same intelligence, it becomes an enhancement to their ability to do destructive things. And so it's not always a good thing to have the intelligence. And that's the kind of picture we see as we go through the whole list. Suppose someone's got that determination. They never give up. They see their plans through, even when they become difficult. Well, if this person's like planning on, I don't know, like an attack or like a school shooting or something, and they're that determined, you'd rather they be lazy and unwilling to follow their plot through to the end, right? So determination can be a good thing if it's a student or like a medical worker or somebody who's using that with a good will. But if you have a bad will, we don't want that person to be the most dedicated and perseverant of all. Charisma, they're funny, outgoing, witty, easy for them to make friends and allies. If the person's a good person with a good will, then that's a great thing because they'll merely win more allies to these righteous and noble causes and do good with it. But if you're an evil person, we don't necessarily want that person to be the life of the party, the most popular individual, because they'll simply win recruits and so forth and acolytes to an evil agenda. So even charisma, determination, intelligence cannot be claimed as always good or unconditionally good. Under some conditions, yes, but others, no. Wealth, power, bravery, same. Bravery, a person's willing to face danger. If it's a firefighter or somebody and they're going to save lives and they have goodwill, good intentions, we want them to be brave. But if this is like a suicide bomber or someone plotting, an attack or whatever, we'd rather that person be so scared that they wouldn't be willing to do the dangerous things that they're considering doing. So wealth magnifies your power in the world to do things. With wealth, you can more easily expend the wealth on the achievement of whatever goals you've set for yourself. So wealth makes things easier, and if you have a good will, then that'll allow you to do good things more easily. But again, if an evil person has a bunch of wealth, that's a concern because they're going to be able to use it for bad things. Power, sure, if power's in the right hands, we want people with a good will to have power. But if it's an evil person like Adolf Hitler, then power simply is not the right thing to want for that type of person. So we can't always say power is good either. Now I know that some of these, the first few that you guys mentioned, might be a little harder to finesse into his discussion than others, but it's possible still. A person's very modest, so they don't come across as vain or arrogant, but they're simply doing this in order to win people's approval as they plot to do evil things because they're evil inside. And I guess we can imagine similarities of point being made here. Now, happiness. Happiness itself, Mill thought, was unconditionally good. And since everyone seeks it as a goal and everything else is a means to it, then that should be the standard that we try to reach for when we do our behavior in life. Try to always take actions that create more happiness rather than less. But Kant says even happiness is not unconditionally good. Like, I can give you one example, right? Suppose that someone finds pleasure, aka happiness, but doing terrible things, like maybe watching videos online of gruesome scenes of death, and they just, for whatever morbid reason, they find that titillating or interesting. That's the promotion of happiness for them. But is this a morally good thing to serve them up these videos so that they can find that enjoyment? This seems to be like happiness, but derived from an immoral source. So that's not happiness that is necessarily a good either. And another possible case, and he mentions this too. Suppose you have a person who's evil with a bad will, but they feel so happy and content, like they feel like they're living their best life. In that case, this person would never change because they're satisfied and they're self-satisfied with their conduct, be it as it may that it's really bad. And furthermore, to an impartial and benevolent spectator, as he calls it, you can never be really happy or satisfied by seeing an evil person with a bad will experiencing that type of joy and happiness. It's like the person doesn't deserve it. So if you see like a serial killer, Richard Ramirez or something, the Night Stalker, smiling and giggling while they're sentencing him to death for, killing a bunch of people and, torturing them, it doesn't make you feel good about their happiness. Like, oh, at least they're happy. That's happiness that's not deserved, and it's not righteous for that happiness to be there. If a good person with a good will has happiness, it's a different case, and then it's a good thing. So returning to the larger point, he says, in comparison with all of these other desirable character traits, there's only one that's unconditionally good, and that's the goodwill. Because again, the goodwill is just trying to act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. That's always a good thing no matter what. But these other qualities, if they are not paired with a goodwill, are not necessarily good in and of themselves. So he's saying, if you want to focus on one thing in your moral life to uphold and to maintain, to stand up, then don't focus on the maximization of pleasure and happiness, because there's no guarantee that that leads to any kind of moral results. Instead, just try to see to it that you have a goodwill, that you act with goodwill and good intent. And if you do, then that will make proper use of all the other qualities that are oftentimes desired by human beings. So like with the goodwill, you'll make proper use of the intelligence, determination, charisma, wealth, power, bravery, etc. that you might accomplish in life. But if you don't have a goodwill, then prioritizing any of these things will not necessarily lead you into a moral result. Like if you just try to become the most intelligent person, you may become the smartest person in the room, but if you don't have a good will, then there's no guarantee that that's going to lead to anything that's valuable morally. I could have put strength up here too. I should have probably put that. You can add it, but strength, like even physical or athletic strength, usually that's a good thing. But if it's a bully or something that's going to just use their massive strength to make fun of and to threaten and intimidate others, then that person you'd hope wouldn't have been so strong, so they wouldn't have been so imposing. But if you have a good will, then all of these qualities will be used in a way that's towards the good. So he says the first priority for you should be to have a good will. And then after that, if you do develop any other desirable character traits, they'll be used in a way that's consistent with morality. But if you just focus on being the funniest person, you might not be moral in the end. You want to be the wealthiest, most powerful, bravest person with determination, but if you don't have moral goodness as a part of your will, then that's not necessarily going to tend towards the good. Okay, now let me read a little bit from him, and you can see his way of putting it. I always try to describe it first in the lecture before hitting you with the author's words so that now it will make more clear sense. So his book is actually called Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. That's the larger work that this is extracted from. On our page 106, it starts by saying this: there is no possibility of thinking of anything at all in this world, or even outside of it, which can be regarded as good without qualification, except a good will. So he's saying there that's the only thing that can be good without qualification. Intelligence, wit, judgment, whatever talents of the mind you might want to name, are doubtless, in many respects, good and desirable, as are such qualities of temperament as courage, resolve, perseverance. But they can also become extremely bad and harmful if the will, which makes use of these gifts, is not good. The same holds with gifts of fortune, power, riches, honor, even health, and that complete well-being and contentment, which is called happiness, make for pride and often even arrogance, unless there is a good will to correct their influence on the mind. And then he says this: the sight of a being that is not graced by any touch of a pure and good will, but who yet enjoys uninterrupted prosperity, can never delight a rational and impartial spectator. So therefore, a good will seems to constitute the indispensable condition of even being worthy of happiness. Okay, so that's why he is concerned to argue that it was wrong for Mill and other people to say promote the most happiness possible, because it's possible to promote happiness but not be doing anything that's actually moral. And likewise with the remainder of those qualities. So the goodwill is what we highlight and emphasize in the ethical system of Kant. Okay, so now it says here that you act with a goodwill when you act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. So that's the blueprint for displaying and fostering and nurturing a goodwill. Act from the motive of duty to uphold the moral law. About the motive of duty now. Kant says that it is only the motive of duty where the action has moral worth. So he says only an act that is done from the motive of duty has moral worth, but an act that is done from the motive of inclination has no moral worth. So now I want to compare and contrast with you guys those two kinds of motives. On the one hand, the motive of duty, versus on the other hand, the motive of inclination. Okay, so let's write the principle one time first though. He's saying that only an act done from the motive of duty has moral worth. Moral worth, moral value. And likewise, an act done instead from the motive of inclination has no moral worth. Okay, so I said that we are going to have 2 meetings on this topic of Kant's ethics. So part 2 is coming on Monday, and wherever we cut off in the next few minutes here, we'll bring that back in the beginning on Monday. But what it says again is that only an act done from the motive of duty has moral worth. An act that is done instead from the motive of inclination does not have any moral worth. Okay, so quickly let's try and figure out what this word inclination means. Let me use it in a sentence, and then based on that, maybe unless you already have a working understanding of it, you can determine what it means. Say that I tell you I have an inclination after this lecture to get some bagels, which is kind of true, actually. There's a very good place near my apartment here. But anyway, yeah, so I'm telling you that I'm inclined to get these bagels today. I have an inclination to get them. What then does this word inclination mean if we could infer that from the context of the sentence there? I have an inclination to buy a PS5 this summer. I'm just kind of waiting because I'm busy with school for the moment. But when summer comes, I'll have a lot of free time. So yeah, giving you examples. What do you think an inclination then is, if you could judge from these examples? When one says they are inclined to do X, or that they have an inclination to do X. That's right, Cordy. Yes, correct. It's a desire or a wish to do it. It's something you want, basically. So if I'm telling you I'm inclined or have an inclination for the bagels, I'm kind of thinking, that sounds good and I want that, or I desire to do that. Same with the PS5 or anything else. So inclinations are just wants, desires for things, goals, wishes. I shouldn't say goals because that sounds a little bit more like an end. So let's go with the wish, a desire, or a want. So then this is saying the following. Only when your act is done strictly from duty's sake alone does it have moral worth. But if you're doing it because you want to do it, because you're inclined to do it, you have your own self-interested desires bound up with it, then it actually lacks moral worth. And there's an example the author gives to make this point somewhat clearer. And I guess that's really where we will pick up on Monday. And let me just note the name of the example. It's talked about a little bit in the essay of Kant, but it's this, the shopkeeper example. So there's this little hypothetical scenario of the shopkeeper. It helps to expand upon the point here. And that's a nice point for us to kind of leave it off for now, and we'll resume with this on Monday. So I'll let you guys go in just a bit here. Just let me say this. I sent off the link for the office hours if anyone wanted to stop by between 11 and 12 just now after the class. Nobody has to do that, but it's there if you want. And you've got the Zoom link in the Canvas announcements. Other than that, the first essays are due next Wednesday, so you still have 5 days or so to work on it. But if there's anybody who's developing any drafts or thoughts, or just wants any kind of comment or feedback, even if it's just a question, you can always ask me by email if you have time. So that's about it for now, I guess. Otherwise, just have a great weekend. Be in touch with me if you need anything, and I'll be checking my messages and everything else. So are we good to go then? Let me know before I close the stream. Just kind of want to make sure I didn't lose anybody and that you're good to go. All right, perfect. Thanks again, everyone. I'll see you back on Monday, and take it easy. Bye-bye.